I entered the site from this direction and started to make my way through. You could also see how deep some of these structures go, and just how much remains unexcavated.
There's structure underneath.
This huge piece of pottery is consistent with the kind one would find in a burial. The level of destruction and desecration of the ancestors buried here was brutal. This was a pretty exciting find, an ancient sandal made of the same rope material that would be wrapped around the mummies.
Oh my gosh, it just goes on.
It was sculpted to have a face where the nose is actually protruding from the piece itself. The first time I had come across a piece of textile with artwork on it.
This is insane.
There is so much of this site that I was able to document and capture, but as you'll see, there's still a lot under the surface waiting to be revealed. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And just as a warning, this video does contain raw footage of desecrated ancient burials, including skeletal remains, so discretion is advised. And with that, let's take a look at this site. Using Google Earth to locate the remnants of unidentified ancient structures in Peru, I came across this unlabeled site here, in a valley nestled along the periphery of the riverbed. It was clear to me that this had to be ruins of ancient architecture, and that the site itself appears to have been vastly looted. I had to go check it out and document what might be left, so I started to make my way. And I didn't put this together until making this video, but take note of these reeds here that grow along the bed of the valley, because we'll see it later. I was in southern Peru in the Paracas and Nasca regions. It was clear to see that some walls were left standing, somewhat intact, but the majority of those walls had crumbled, leaving the stones littered across the landscape. I entered the site from this direction and started to make my way through.
Dug deep here.
Everywhere you could see stones and piles where the walls used to be. The site had obviously been looted, and I couldn't take a step without running into several pottery fragments.
Large pieces of pottery.
Based on the construction method of the stones, the pieces of pottery, and the textiles I would find at the site, I would have to say that this was likely attributed to the Paracas or Nasca culture. The Paracas flourished from 800 BCE to about 100 BCE and were directly followed by the Nasca, who were around until about 600 CE. Both used small stones joined with calcareous mud to form the foundations and walls, and occasionally used wood from the huarango tree as beams for roofing, and would also use reeds and thatch in an adobe mud mixture to help shape those walls and those roofs. You'll frequently find maize at many of the burials because the deceased were buried with them, usually in pieces of pottery, to take with them on their journey in the afterlife.
Wow, they dug deep in here.
There was this huge piece of intact pottery, which you don't come across very often, as so much is either broken or removed by looters, but perhaps it was left because of its relative plainness, because as you'll see later in this video, some of the pieces at this site were beautifully designed. It looked like it was exhumed from the looted pit right next to it because there were pieces of cotton, and this piece of rope here looks like it had been fashioned to maybe be a belt or a part of a head wrap of some sort. You can see bones left carelessly strewn about the site, an unfortunate but typical result of looting.
There's structure underneath here. They're digging through the roofs.
In some of the looted pits, you can see that a layer of thatch had been broken through, either roofs or possibly the tops of burials in my estimation. You could also see how deep some of these structures go, and just how much remains unexcavated. At first I thought this was a piece of pottery, but it was actually a stone that had painted designs on it.
They were drawing on it.
Some of the same type of designs and pigment that are found on the pottery. This was an expansive city with multiple homes, and given that there was clearly structure buried deep underneath the surface, I wondered if subsequent cultures could have repurposed this location. Because these walls here share some similarities with the northern Wayuri, but they're also just a bit more rudimentary than what they were known for. So I wonder if this was a population that potentially occupied this area before the Wayuri, but after the Nasca. There's a piece of wood here, and you'll see several throughout the site, probably the huarango wood used by the Paracas as support beams. And inside the pit that it probably came from, you can see thatch and reeds poking through the walls. Here was another one of those rope bands, which probably came out of a burial next to a piece of cotton and maize. And right next to it was this beautifully patterned pottery sherd, which seemed to be consistent with the Paracas or Nasca culture. As I kept snaking my way through the site, the drone helped to make out more of the foundations of some of these structures. But it also showed the depth and the extent of the looting that had taken place here. This site is about 35 miles inland from the coast of Peru, so it was pretty wild to be finding seashells peppered throughout the site. Now, it wasn't an extensive amount, but they were scattered throughout the location, and although it could be the result of some sort of monumental environmental shift, it was more likely the result of a vast network of trade. This huge piece of pottery is consistent with the kind one would find in a burial, and near it were human bones, cotton, and rope. It was clear that looters had broken through some sort of thatched structure, which again made me naturally wonder how deep might this architecture still go. The following might be disturbing, so some viewers may want to skip to the next section, but in this looting pit was the corpse of half of a dog.
That's a dog.
It's likely that this poor animal had been accompanying some of the looters over the past few decades, and something happened to it and it was simply left in one of the dug pits. Scanning the site with both the drone and from the satellite, there was a patch of debris here that I also needed to check out, so I started to make my way. Walking through the middle of the site, I came across another large piece of pottery, and even more indications of those layers of thatch that seemed to be buried underneath my feet.
These walls all under here. Thatching, like perhaps thatched roofs.
But in this pit here was the best evidence for full-length reeds. Those same reeds I saw growing in the valley as I was driving to the site itself. It made it pretty clear to me, at least, that these were in fact being used as structural components for the buildings here at the site.
My God.
As I got closer to that patch of debris, it became pretty apparent what it was, and it was sad. It was trash, and it seemed like this little section of the site was almost used like a landfill, as this trash was all the same material and contained the same contents. Unfortunately, this is not an abnormal occurrence to find at obscure sites and locations in Peru. Next, I wanted to make it to this upper section. And I was continuing to find pottery sherds and some pieces of larger ceramic vessels, typical of the burials in this region. But this was a pretty exciting find, an ancient sandal made of the same rope material that would be wrapped around the mummies. This area of the site is where I started to find the most polychrome pottery with those beautiful and intricate designs.
How awesome that is.
So this was in part evidence to me that at least at some point the Nasca had occupied this location. They were the first to implement the technique of painting on the clay before firing the ceramic. This piece here was oddly heavy in comparison to the other pieces of ceramics I was finding. It clearly appeared to be burnt, so maybe it had a specific purpose in a home for some sort of cooking. Right next to it is a good example of the reeds as they are vertically sticking out from the ground. It's possible that this pile of brown and white cotton was being stored here and became unearthed during the looting process, but the fact that there were bones nearby indicated to me that it was more likely, unfortunately, from a mummy that was once wrapped in the material. This find here was pretty remarkable, and the first time I had come across a piece of textile with artwork on it. It was pretty faint, but it also helped to solidify the notion that the Paracas may have occupied this territory before the Nasca, as it was the Paracas who really cultivated this type of technique of embroidery. The Nasca did it as well, and given that these two cultures were on the heels of one another, it's possible that this site was home to them both. At several sites in the Peruvian desert, caches of crops are consistently found. These caches are a storage of resources for the communities that once occupied the area, and that's what I believe I was finding here towards the edge of this portion of the site. There were so many pieces of maize that attributing it to a burial didn't make much sense, so I think what looters found here were some of those storage caches. Making my way back to where I had entered the site, from higher up along the mountain here, it was easier to make out the foundational outlines of the structures. There was still one part of this site that I wanted to check out, and it was directly across on the opposite side from the main location. You can see more reeds poking out from the earth, all in a uniform line and bundled together, which speaks to purposeful construction. It's possible that some of these ropes were maybe nets, but again, being 35 miles from the coast where nets were mainly used for fishing, it would make it more likely that these ropes here were actually those used on the mummy bundles of the deceased. I wasn't fully prepared for what I was about to see exploring this side of the site. I've seen looting at virtually every place I've been to in Peru, but the savagery of what was on display here was on another level.
Oh my gosh. It just goes on.
It became apparent that the cotton and textile was all from exhumed burials.
Oh wow.
There were several amazing and beautifully designed pieces of pottery that really spoke to the advancement of the cultural identity of the ancient peoples that lived here. This other piece, the spout of a jar, was colored with the typical red and black pigment found in the region. But beyond that, it was sculpted to have a face where the nose is actually protruding from the piece itself. I climbed up onto the next ridge to get a better vantage point of the area, and I was pretty shocked to see that there were undeniable stone walls buried deep in the sand and sediment.
There's structure underneath. This is insane. So all of that, it's not, there's trash amongst it, but all of that is cotton. Cotton. textile from what the mummies were usually wrapped in. You can still look at the mummies that they have on display from down south, the ones that are on display as they've been preserved and as they found them.
For context, this is footage from the museum at the Chachilla Cemetery in Nasca, showing what some of the mummies looked like when they were buried. These here, also from Chachilla, are original Nazca mummies put on display showing how they were wrapped and placed in tombs. So now back at the site I was exploring, I was trying to imagine the greed and the intent that it would take to literally tear these mummies apart to find any goods that they might have been buried with. The level of destruction and desecration of the ancestors buried here was brutal. You could see bones still wrapped in the cotton, and since the desert preserves things so well, you can even see the red hair attached to the skull, which has been a common feature found amongst the ancient Paracas peoples. It was a devastating thing to soak in. These were all once fully intact. Here was the hand of another ancestor, completely removed from its remains and its resting place. It hurts your heart to witness something like this level of desecration. And there's clearly such a need to protect and preserve ancient sites like this, and they still have so much left to uncover and to teach us. And if you're anything like me, the very first question you ask is, why isn't more being done to protect these sites? And the truth is, that's a really tall order, because there's just so many sites in Peru. It isn't lost on me that there are likely some resources available and things can be diverted in order to fund efforts like this. And sometimes things like that do happen. There are organizations that when looting is reported, drones are sent out to scout those sites. But the truth is, because of the sheer quantity of sites in Peru, the resources needed pale in comparison to whatever can be made available. Again, there are so many places just like this, places with such historical wealth that we may never get a chance to investigate. And it is my hope that this channel can be a driving force in putting some of these places on the map, and ideally garnishing enough interest to put together a team with the proper equipment to excavate, document, and investigate these ancient sites. Unfortunately, between persistent looting and agricultural expansion that threatens these sites daily, for some of these sacred places, we actually may never have the chance to investigate them. But I will keep documenting every single one that I can while I have the chance. And if you're interested in helping with those efforts, there's a GoFundMe set up to help with these expeditions that will be linked in the description below, as well as a ton of other ways to support this channel. Oh, and if you're interested in taking a look and playing around with some of the 3D models from this and other sites, please consider becoming a member, where access to those is available. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Definitely leave any thoughts or questions in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.